Fame is a mirage. You run toward it, thinking it will quench your thirst. But when you finally reach it, all you find is sand slipping through your hands.
The headlines read like the closing act of a Hollywood dream gone sour. Michelle Pfeiffer, once the dazzling emblem of cinema's golden age, had quietly vanished. After decades of commanding every frame she appeared in, the woman once hailed as the face of the 20th century seemed to have stepped out of her own story. Rumors began to swirl through the tabloids. Had she walked away at her peak, suffered a breakdown, or had the very industry she once defined finally turned its back on her? The questions grew louder than any statement Michelle herself ever made. Now, at 67, her silence feels almost elegiac, because the truth beneath it isn't about an actress who retired. It's about a woman devoured by the same world that built her throne. To millions, she was Catwoman, the unforgettable anti-heroine in Batman Returns. She was Susie Diamond, the broken nightclub singer from the fabulous Baker Boys, whose performance earned her a Golden Globe and an Oscar nod. She was Elvira Hancock, the icy muse beside Al Pacino in Scarface, forever etched into cinematic memory. Every decade bore her imprint. Every role became a piece of cultural history. But behind those timeless performances stood a woman quietly losing herself. Few people knew that Michelle had stumbled into acting almost by accident, a small-town girl from a working-class family who never truly felt she belonged among Hollywood's elite. Even fewer understood how deeply she resented the machinery that demanded her perfection. The downfall of Michelle Pfeiffer didn't come with a scandal or a single breaking point. It unfolded slowly, through compromises, impossible standards, and the quiet decision to vanish. While her contemporaries in the late 1990s were signing multi-million-dollar franchise deals, Michelle was saying no. When others fought for magazine covers, she disappeared from public view. By the early 2000s, she had all but withdrawn, leaving fans and critics to wonder what had happened. Some blamed the ruthless cult of youth, a system that chews up its actresses once they show a hint of time. Others saw her retreat as an act of defiance, a refusal to play a game she had long despised. Yet Michelle herself never spoke. No dramatic farewell, no memoir, just a haunting quiet. That silence became its own kind of headline, because when a light that bright suddenly dims, the darkness it leaves behind only deepens the mystery. Over the years, pieces of a more painful truth surfaced. The strange cult she was drawn into as a struggling actress, the isolation she carried in an industry that feeds on fragility, the relentless self-doubt that shadowed even her greatest triumphs. Those who worked with her spoke of an artist so exacting that it bordered on self-punishment, a perfectionism that cost her opportunities and sometimes connection. Now, at 67, Michelle Pfeiffer remains both present and gone, revered but unreachable, admired yet unseen, a legend who haunts the very kingdom that once worshipped her. But her disappearance was never just an escape. It was the culmination of years of quiet erosion. Behind the glamour lay exhaustion. Behind the beauty lay fear. And behind the myth lay a woman fighting to reclaim herself. Her tragedy is not that she vanished from the screen. It's that even in her brightest hour, the fading had already begun. And the truth behind that is far darker than anyone ever imagined.
Long before she was the shimmering icon of the silver screen, Michelle Pfeiffer was a girl growing up under the California sun, restless and uncertain about who she was meant to be. Born in 1958 in Santa Ana, California, she was the second of 4 children in a working-class family. Her father, a heating and air conditioning contractor, worked long hours. Her mother stayed home, raising the children in a modest, often chaotic household. Money was tight, dreams felt far away, and the Pfeiffer kids learned early that life would not hand them anything easily. Michelle was shy as a child, so shy that teachers would often mistake her quietness for disinterest. In truth, she carried a deep sensitivity, an inner world that was hard to put into words. While other children excelled in sports or academics, Michelle floated somewhere in between, observing, feeling, absorbing. She had beauty, even as a teenager, a striking symmetry that drew attention, but it often embarrassed her more than it empowered her. She was aware of being looked at, yet never sure of what people really saw. In interviews years later, Michelle admitted that she never thought of herself as particularly talented or destined for greatness. She worked odd jobs, supermarket cashier, clerk, barely scraping by, always with the nagging sense that something was missing. Acting, at first, wasn't even a dream. It was an escape hatch, a way to try something, anything, that might feel larger than the life she knew. But Hollywood has a way of luring the lost. At 20, Michelle entered the Miss Orange County beauty pageant. She didn't win the crown, but she won something else: visibility. Agents noticed her. Casting directors began calling. For a girl with no roadmap, no connections, and little confidence, it was intoxicating. The pageant was supposed to be a one-off experiment. Instead, it was the doorway into a world she couldn't yet understand. And yet, behind this accidental entry into Hollywood, Michelle stumbled into one of the most dangerous traps of her early life: a cult. The group called themselves Breatharians. They preached that humans could live without food or water, surviving solely on sunlight and air. Vulnerable, insecure, and searching for belonging, Michelle was drawn into their orbit. They told her she was special. They told her she could transcend the ordinary. For a young woman who had always felt invisible, the promise was seductive. But the cult's demands grew darker. Members pressured her to hand over money, to sever ties with outside friends, to devote herself entirely. Michelle later described it as psychological manipulation that nearly consumed her. She was working part-time jobs just to support their teachings, growing thinner and more isolated, her spirit fraying.
It might have destroyed her completely, if not for an unlikely intervention. While taking an acting class, Michelle befriended actor Peter Horton, who would later star in 30-something. Horton saw what was happening and pulled her back. He introduced her to others outside the cult, helping her slowly regain her independence. Years later, Michelle would say that she owed her very survival to that chance connection. This brush with the cult was more than a youthful misstep. It left a scar, a reminder of how easily she could be swallowed by forces larger than herself, how fragile her sense of identity really was. That wound, the desperate hunger for validation, would follow her into Hollywood, where predators and power brokers thrived on precisely that vulnerability. Still, Michelle was determined to reinvent herself. She enrolled in acting classes, pushed through auditions, and took small television parts. She was, by her own admission, not very good at first. Directors dismissed her as just another pretty face. Some told her outright that she would never be taken seriously. She was the girl who had walked out of a beauty pageant, hardly the pedigree of an actress in an era dominated by Meryl Streep, Jessica Lange, and Jane Fonda. But rejection has a strange way of hardening resolve. Michelle threw herself into the craft, often staying late after class, practicing lines, dissecting scenes. She wanted to prove, to herself, perhaps more than anyone, that she was more than the pretty girl.
There is a moment, often invisible in hindsight, when a star's path begins to shift. For Michelle, it was a role in the ill-fated Grease 2 in 1982. The film was panned, mocked, dismissed as a poor sequel to a beloved classic. Michelle herself admitted later that she cringed watching it. But in the ashes of that failure, something crucial happened. Hollywood noticed her. Not for brilliance, not yet, but for presence. She had an energy that pierced even the worst script. And that presence would catch the eye of someone who could change her life. The man was Brian De Palma, the director who had cast her in Scarface. It was her first real chance, and the role would make her unforgettable. But fate, as always, came with a shadow. But the man who first gave her that chance would also be the one to set her on a path that nearly broke her.
Hollywood has a way of turning failures into stepping stones, and for Michelle Pfeiffer, the disappointment of Grease 2 unexpectedly opened the door to something much greater. The movie may have been a disaster, but hidden in that chaos, directors and producers saw something they couldn't ignore: a raw presence, a quiet intensity that flickered beneath her beauty. It was Brian De Palma who first recognized it. When casting for Scarface, his gritty reimagining of the Cuban drug underworld, he needed someone to play Elvira Hancock, the icy, troubled lover of Al Pacino's Tony Montana. Dozens of names were floated, but none seemed right. Then came Michelle, almost an afterthought, walking into the audition with a hunger that was impossible to fake. The story goes that during her audition, she was asked to read a tense dinner scene opposite Pacino. Nervous and trembling, she channeled that fear into the performance itself. Her hands shook, her eyes darted, her voice cracked at just the right moments. When she finished, the room fell silent. What could have been seen as nerves became undeniable authenticity. De Palma turned to his team and said simply, "That's her." Filming Scarface was brutal. Michelle was so committed to embodying Elvira's hollow, drug-ravaged existence that she starved herself to dangerous levels. She later admitted surviving on little more than tomato soup and cigarettes, shedding pounds until her body ached. The physical toll was immense, but it worked. On screen, she was haunting, fragile and dangerous, glamorous and broken. It was a performance that seared itself into cinema history. Overnight, Michelle Pfeiffer was no longer the failed sequel girl. She was the woman who could stand toe-to-toe with Al Pacino and not disappear. Critics praised her, audiences remembered her, and Hollywood suddenly wanted her. But fame is a double-edged sword. Alongside the recognition came the whisper that she was difficult. She wasn't the type to smile politely at every suggestion. She demanded retakes when she felt her work wasn't truthful. She pushed against the shallow roles often handed to women in the 1980s. While other actresses coasted on charm, Michelle was obsessed with craft. That obsession, at first, made her unforgettable. In time, it would become the very weight that pulled her under. The mid-1980s brought her a string of defining roles. In Into the Night, she revealed both vulnerability and edge. In The Witches of Eastwick, she stood alongside Jack Nicholson, Cher, and Susan Sarandon, proving she could shine, even in an ensemble of giants. Every role seemed to lift her higher, every performance more layered than the last. She wasn't just a beautiful face. She was an actress with depth, with something dangerous in her eyes that audiences couldn't look away from.
Behind the scenes, though, Michelle was still searching for stability. She struggled with self-doubt, often questioning whether she deserved her success. Colleagues described her as meticulous, almost punishing toward herself. She would agonize over scenes, replaying them in her mind long after the director had called cut. That perfectionism made her brilliant, but it also made her fragile. Then came The Fabulous Baker Boys in 1989, the role that cemented her as one of the greatest of her generation.
Playing Susie Diamond, a down-on-her-luck lounge singer, Michelle delivered not only acting, but also live singing that stunned audiences. Draped across a piano, singing "Makin' Whoopee," she became a cultural phenomenon. It was sultry, magnetic, iconic. Yet behind that moment was a woman terrified of failure, rehearsing until her voice cracked, convinced she would disappoint. The performance won her a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. For many, it was the pinnacle. For Michelle, it was another reminder that the higher she climbed, the farther she could fall. And that fall was already beginning to show. As her fame rose, so too did the pressure. Hollywood wanted her in every major role. Directors fought for her, magazines crowned her, studios relied on her to carry their films. But with every offer came another compromise, another piece of herself chipped away. The girl who once felt invisible was now everywhere. Yet inside, she felt more unseen than ever. She admitted in interviews that she was lonely, that she often returned from glamorous premieres to an empty house, stripped of the adoration that had surrounded her hours earlier. The applause faded, the lights dimmed, and she was left alone with the same gnawing doubts she had carried since childhood. Her rise to fame was meteoric, dazzling, unforgettable. But within that rise was the seed of her unraveling. Because for Michelle Pfeiffer, success was never simply a gift. It was a burden, one that grew heavier with every new triumph. And at the very peak, the cracks began to show.
By the early 1990s, Michelle Pfeiffer was not just famous, she was untouchable. Every director wanted her. Every magazine cover declared her the definitive face of Hollywood. She was, for a moment, the actress who seemed to define what stardom looked like. It was in Batman Returns in 1992 that her place in pop culture was sealed forever. Cast as Selina Kyle, the meek secretary who transforms into Catwoman, Michelle created one of the most iconic female roles in cinematic history. Dressed in stitched black latex, hissing lines with equal parts pain and seduction, she gave the character a tragic depth that had never been seen in a comic book movie. Critics wrote that she had stolen the film from Michael Keaton's Batman and Danny DeVito's Penguin. For audiences, she became the Catwoman, so much so that decades later, no successor has ever escaped her shadow. That role became a symbol. To the world, she was power wrapped in elegance. To Michelle herself, it was another performance that cost her more than most could imagine. The latex suit was so suffocating, she could only wear it for limited stretches before nearly passing out. The hours in makeup, the endless takes, the physical and emotional exhaustion, all of it chipped away at her, even as it elevated her to legend. Her string of acclaimed performances continued. In Love Field, she played a housewife whose life is changed by the civil rights movement, a performance that earned her an Academy Award nomination. In Dangerous Liaisons, she delivered a heartbreaking portrayal of virtue destroyed by manipulation, one that left audiences shaken and critics awed. She was no longer fighting for respect, she was now spoken of in the same breath as Streep, Lange, and Close. But fame is a cruel master. With every award nomination, every box office triumph, the pressure mounted. Studios wanted her in everything. Fans expected her to embody perfection in every role. And beneath that glittering surface, Michelle was struggling. Colleagues later described her as deeply private, almost reclusive, even when surrounded by crowds. At premieres, she would smile, pose, answer questions, but inside, she felt like she was playing another role, the role of Michelle Pfeiffer, movie star. She went home drained, often collapsing into silence. There were stories, whispered in industry circles, of her near-obsessive preparation.
She would memorize entire scripts weeks in advance, dissect every gesture, demand retakes when she felt a scene lacked authenticity. Some directors admired her rigor, others found it exhausting. One producer admitted off the record that Michelle worked harder on a role than anyone he had ever seen, yet seemed to take less joy from the process than almost anyone else. It was during this period that cracks began to show in her personal life. She had married actor Peter Horton in the early 1980s, but the marriage fell apart under the weight of Hollywood schedules and relentless ambition. Friends said she was devastated, yet she rarely spoke of it publicly. By the time she adopted her daughter Claudia in 1993, Michelle was navigating life as a single mother, balancing fame with an aching sense of solitude.
Ironically, at the very peak of her influence, Michelle Pfeiffer was most invisible to herself. She had achieved everything an actress could dream of: iconic roles, critical acclaim, financial security, and an aura of timeless beauty. But inside, she confessed, she often felt like an imposter, someone who had fooled the world into believing she was more than she truly was. The industry only magnified this insecurity. Hollywood has always been merciless toward women, and by the time Michelle entered her mid-30s, whispers began about younger actresses coming to take her place. She still looked radiant, still commanded the screen, but she was already confronting the brutal reality that for actresses, even the peak comes with an expiration date. Her friends noticed the toll. One recalled how Michelle, after an exhausting shoot, would retreat into herself, replaying her perceived mistakes over and over. Another said she rarely celebrated her victories because in her mind, they were already slipping away. To the public, none of this was visible. On the outside, Michelle Pfeiffer was the ultimate Hollywood goddess, beloved and respected. She could walk into any studio, any award show, and silence the room with her presence. She was, for a brief and dazzling moment, the center of it all. But behind the curtain, the woman who carried Catwoman's whip and Susie Diamond's sultry songs was fading. The world adored the star, but they missed the human being quietly unraveling inside. While the world watched the star, they missed the person fading inside. Success can be blinding. From the outside, Michelle Pfeiffer seemed to have everything: awards, critical acclaim, beauty that refused to fade, and roles that others would kill for. But what the world didn't see was the slow erosion happening behind closed doors. The truth is that Michelle's relationship with Hollywood was never a comfortable one. The same industry that lifted her up also drained her, piece by piece. She had always been hypercritical of herself, but as the 1990s wore on, that self-criticism hardened into something darker. She stopped seeing her own success, focusing only on her flaws. A film could earn glowing reviews, but Michelle would go home and obsess over a line she thought she delivered wrong, or a close-up that made her feel exposed. Perfectionism, once her greatest strength, had become her enemy. Colleagues recalled how she would spend days agonizing over scenes that others had moved past. She was brilliant, one director later said, but she never believed it. It was like she was fighting with herself on every set. Hollywood only sharpened those wounds. By the late 1990s, a wave of younger actresses, fresh faces, new names, were flooding the industry. Magazine covers that once begged for Michelle's presence now sought the next ingenue. And while male stars aged into gravitas, Michelle felt the unspoken sentence handed to nearly every actress: invisibility. Her career, though still filled with strong roles, began to feel like a narrowing tunnel. Wolf with Jack Nicholson, Up Close and Personal with Robert Redford, Dangerous Minds. Films that did well, but never quite matched the cultural shockwaves of her earlier work.
Critics began using words like safe choices. Studios questioned her box office draw. For a woman who had once been Hollywood's crown jewel, it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. The toll showed not only in her career, but also in her spirit. She admitted in rare interviews that she was lonely, that she often felt trapped by her own expectations. "I'm my own worst critic," she confessed. But behind that understatement was a deeper truth. She was slipping into something close to despair. The press didn't make it easier. Tabloids obsessed over her appearance, scrutinizing every wrinkle, every ounce of weight gained or lost. For a woman who had never wanted to be defined by beauty, it was torture. In 1999, one magazine cruelly suggested she was aging out of Hollywood, a headline that Michelle herself admitted haunted her. Even her private life was not immune. Though she remarried, finding a more stable partnership with television producer David E. Kelley, the pressures of balancing family and fame gnawed at her. She had long dreamed of being a devoted mother, but Hollywood's schedules made that dream almost impossible. She felt she was failing both her children and her craft, two worlds constantly pulling her apart. And then came the roles she didn't take. By the early 2000s, Michelle Pfeiffer had become notorious for turning down parts that might have extended her dominance. She rejected Silence of the Lambs, which went to Jodie Foster and became a cultural phenomenon. She passed on Pretty Woman, a role that transformed Julia Roberts into America's sweetheart. She turned down Casino, Basic Instinct, and more. To outsiders, it seemed reckless. To Michelle, it was survival. She was terrified of making the wrong choice, of failing under the spotlight again. But those missed opportunities fed the narrative that she was slipping, that she was no longer the star she once was. Industry insiders began whispering, was Michelle Pfeiffer still relevant? Could she still carry a film? The irony was cruel. Her perfectionism, her refusal to compromise, was now painting her as obsolete. The cracks widened into a quiet downfall. By the mid-2000s, she all but vanished from the screen. Years passed without a major role. Directors stopped calling as often. Audiences, once captivated, moved on to new names. No one knew it then, but the end was already on its way. Because Michelle's silence wasn't just about career strategy, it was about survival. The very industry that had once given her an identity had also hollowed her out. She needed distance, a break from the lights, the cameras, the endless judgment. She retreated into private life, raising her children, staying away from red carpets. To many, it looked like a choice. In truth, it was the result of years of emotional exhaustion. The downfall of Michelle Pfeiffer wasn't a headline scandal, wasn't a public breakdown. It was slower, quieter, almost invisible. It was the gradual fading of a woman who had given everything to the screen and found herself emptied in return. And when she finally stepped away, the silence left behind was deafening.
By the time the new millennium arrived, Michelle Pfeiffer was already slipping out of Hollywood's center. What began as subtle distance turned into near disappearance. Roles grew fewer, public appearances became rare, and the woman who once dominated screens seemed to vanish almost overnight. For fans, it was shocking. In the 1980s and 1990s, you could not escape her face. Now, even the tabloids stopped chasing her. She had become what no one expected Michelle Pfeiffer to be: invisible. Her absence was not dramatic. There was no farewell speech, no explosive scandal. Instead, it was the slow fade of a star retreating into shadows. She dedicated herself to her family, raising her children in quiet Northern California. For years, the glamorous Michelle, who once stole the screen in Scarface or Batman Returns, lived like any suburban mother, school runs, family dinners, walks away from cameras. But the silence was its own kind of tragedy. Hollywood has little patience for absence, and by the time Michelle considered a return, the industry had already moved on. Scripts went to younger actresses. Studios questioned whether audiences even remembered her. She was once the first choice for directors. Now she was not on the list at all. Her rare returns to the screen in the late 2000s and 2010s were reminders of what had been lost. In Stardust, she played a witch with chilling elegance, stealing scenes despite a limited role. In Hairspray, she radiated charisma as a villainous mother. Each performance was like a spark in the dark, enough to remind audiences of her brilliance, yet painful in how fleeting it was. Behind these appearances, Michelle confessed to feeling out of step with the industry. She said she no longer knew how to play the Hollywood game. Networking, premieres, publicity, things once obligatory, now felt unbearable. She was older, yes, but more than that, she was tired. The tragedy deepened because Michelle had not lost her talent. If anything, age had given her more depth, more complexity. But Hollywood's machinery has always been cruelest to women. A man in his 60s is considered wise, dignified. A woman in her 60s is often dismissed as past her prime. And Michelle Pfeiffer, despite everything she had given, was not spared that injustice. In interviews, she admitted regret, not about leaving, but about how much she had allowed perfectionism to dictate her choices. She had turned down films that became classics because she feared she could not live up to them. She had obsessed over mistakes no one else even noticed, and in doing so, she had slowly cut herself off from the very thing that once gave her meaning. By 67, Michelle Pfeiffer was a name wrapped in silence. The young woman who once stood trembling across from Al Pacino had become a ghost in her own industry. The tragedy was not scandalous or sensational. It was the quiet erasure of a woman whose brilliance deserved better. For audiences, the loss was profound. They had grown up with her. They had fallen in love with her characters, quoted her lines, hung posters of her on their walls. And now, when they looked for her, she was gone. The final cruelty was that her story contained no dramatic conclusion. There was no climactic fall, no fiery scandal. Instead, there was the simple and heartbreaking reality of fading away, a slow vanishing act, more painful than any headline could capture. For Michelle Pfeiffer, the climax of her story was not one explosive tragedy, but the tragedy of silence. A career that once defined an era had become a ghost story. A woman who once embodied every shade of strength and vulnerability was now remembered in fragments. Catwoman's claws, Susie Diamond's song, Elvira's icy glare. And for those who had watched her rise, the quiet disappearance was almost harder to bear than any scandal, because the star had not burned out. It had simply gone dark.
Looking back now, Michelle Pfeiffer's story feels less like a straight line and more like a haunting echo. She was the face of Hollywood at its most glamorous, a performer whose presence defined an era. And yet, her legacy is not just in the roles she played, it is in the silence she chose. What she left behind is complex. For some, she will forever be Catwoman, the definitive symbol of female power wrapped in fragility. For others, she is Susie Diamond, singing on top of a piano, embodying every ache of ambition and heartbreak. For still others, she is Elvira Hancock in Scarface, a reminder of how beauty can conceal despair. Each role is a mirror, reflecting not only Michelle's range, but also the hidden costs of inhabiting characters so deeply.
colleagues who worked with her often speak of two Michelles, the luminous actress on set and the quiet, private woman off it. They describe her as meticulous, generous, and unrelenting in her pursuit of truth in performance. They also remember the loneliness, the distance, the sense that even at the height of her fame, she was never fully present in the world that adored her. Her family sees another side. To her children, she is not Catwoman or Elvira. She is simply their mother, the woman who stepped away from Hollywood because she valued them more than the spotlight. That choice, while costing her career, also gave her something the industry never could, a life of her own. And perhaps that is her true legacy. Michelle Pfeiffer's story is not just about what fame gives, but what it takes. It is about the dangerous mirage of perfection, about the way Hollywood can elevate and erase in the same breath. Her tragedy is not that she failed, it is that she succeeded so completely only to realize the prize was emptier than she imagined. The lessons linger. For young actors, her story is a warning about the seduction of fame and the toll of perfectionism. For audiences, it is a reminder that the people we idolize on screen are rarely the same as the ones who go home when the cameras shut off. And for Michelle herself, it is a truth she once put into her own words. Fame is not real life. It's a performance of a performance. Her disappearance, her silence, is its own kind of statement. By walking away, she revealed what the spotlight often hides, that behind every glamorous image is a human being who can only carry so much. It brings us back to where we began, fame as a mirage. Michelle Pfeiffer chased it, caught it, embodied it more completely than almost anyone. But when the lights dimmed, all that remained was the woman who had always been searching for something deeper, something real. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring reflection of her legacy. The knowledge that even the brightest star can fade, but the lesson of their journey remains.
Hollywood thrives on the illusion of beauty, power, and eternal youth. But Michelle Pfeiffer's journey shatters that illusion, revealing the fractures beneath the gloss. Her downfall wasn't only her own, it was systemic. This is an industry that crowns women young, only to exile them the moment time dares to touch their faces, or when they refuse to bend. The media feeds on their absence, the studios profit from their fear, and audiences unknowingly consume the remains. At 67, Michelle Pfeiffer stands as both a warning and a quiet victory. She turned away from the chaos, choosing peace over applause, truth over illusion. Yet her absence still echoes, a reminder of what fame demands and what it leaves behind. We tell the stories that the spotlight erases,